Hey everyone, and welcome to another weekly art video. I hope you're having an amazing day wherever you are in the world, and thanks so much for joining me on this one. In today's tutorial, I'm going to be sharing my full process for a pen and ink rose drawing. I'm going to be sharing my entire process in real time, starting with how I create my preliminary pencil sketch freehand, stemming loosely from a reference photo, to the specific pen and ink techniques that I enjoy using in order to bring in a sense of dimension and depth to the piece. I also included this extra part in the beginning before jumping into the drawing process, where I share with you how I edit my photo in a photo editing software in order to have a better reference photo to work from and have a smoother drawing process and also arrive at better overall results. I'm going to make sure to leave a link down below in the description box of this video where you're going to be able to download my edited reference photo in case you'd like to work on this rose drawing alongside me. All right, so without much further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I found a beautiful photo that I thought would work great for this study via, I think it was Pexels or Pixabay.com. I downloaded it and I opened it up in Photoshop, which is a photo editing software that I like using. And you can see me right there rotating the photo until the position of that flower was just a way that I wanted it to be in my drawing, or more similar to something that I would want in my drawing. I modified the cropping a little bit, and right here you can see me prepare a full colored version of this photo as well as a grayscale version of this photo. Why am I doing this, you might ask? Because at times I like working from grayscale photos and other times I like working from full color photos. And when someone is just getting started with achieving any sort of realism, of variety of values and depth and contrast in their work, it's very, very helpful to work from grayscale or desaturated or black and white photos, because in black and white photos, all of the different colors present in our photo get unified and merged into only one same scale, going from darkest darks, which would be blacks, a wide range of values in between, dark to lighter grays, and then the lightest values would be white. And because we're going to be focusing on values, meaning on pinpointing dark areas and midtone areas and lightest areas, when we're laying down our lines and marks as we're doing our alternative shading techniques today, using a black and white photo is going to be super helpful. As I am doing all of this, I also like observing the photo. It's always great to observe your reference before putting pencil, pen, or paintbrush to paper. Observe those nuances, the overlapping petals, the irregular shapes created by the petals. Another thing that I like doing is noticing which areas might present a bit of a challenge and starting to think of what strategies I might want to use in order to move through that process more successfully. Okay, so it's time to get started with my freehand sketch. And the first thing that I always do is I get started with the block-in phase, which I sometimes refer to as the envelope phase. Why envelope? Because I essentially imagine whatever it is that I'm drawing as being wrapped in wrapping paper and just seeing these angles around it, right? I'm not thinking of curves. I'm not thinking of small irregularities throughout the edges of those petals. None of that. I am just seeing the main angles created and the overall general proportions, the length versus the width of that big blocky outer silhouette shape, if you will. So this right here that I am sharing with you, this yellow shape around the entirety of the petal area of the rose, is what you're going to see me start my drawing with. And from there, after having achieved that general overall shape, I'm going to then break it up into medium-sized shapes. And finally, I'm going to be adding the smallest shapes and I'm going to be refining everything. So I always make my way from general towards specifics, from large towards small. I tune out the smallest details, the things that don't matter, because initially I am just focusing on achieving proportions, on adding in simplified shapes just to make sure that I have included all of the petals that I'm going to be adding into my final drawing, making sure that those petals have a good location in relation with each other, and that kind of thing. And as I move along, I refine those shapes and I add little nuances and things like that. You're going to notice how, especially when I just got started with the drawing process, I am drawing very, very lightly. And this is because I want to avoid scratching and damaging my paper. And I also don't want to be able to see my graphite pencil at the end. At the end, I just want to see the pen and ink. I don't want to see the graphite. So I want to be able to erase that graphite eventually. And finally, I want to be able to easily erase mistakes and refine my drawing as I move along. It's very helpful to get started with the largest shapes first and to train yourself to simplify everything, because this is how you're going to be able to much more easily achieve more effective proportions and also make better use of your drawing space. Learning to simplify is key, in my opinion, for any artist. And these skills are going to help you, doesn't matter what it is that you like to draw or paint. All right, so I am all done with creating that outermost silhouette, that outermost simplified, blocky, angular shape. And I am now getting started with separating out my individual petals and starting to visualize more medium-sized shapes within this larger general shape. When it comes to drawing or sketching flowers, I oftentimes like starting with the outer petal shapes and I make my way in. This makes sense because usually when it comes to flowers, or at least most types of flowers, the shapes created by the outer petals are going to be larger than the shapes created by the middle petals and the innermost petals. I'm making sure to continue drawing as lightly as possible so that I can keep erasing mistakes and refine my drawing as I go. As I'm moving along, continuing to add in more shapes and lines to my drawing, these new shapes and lines add more kind of guide points or landmarks that you can use to continue comparing and contrasting widths, lengths, angles, locations of different elements in relation with each other. And the more elements and lines and shapes that you add into your drawing, the more of these landmarks you have, and thus the easier it gets to tell little mistakes that need to be fixed. One tip I have for you that really helps me is whenever I see a petal that is folding a lot or is maybe bent or curved, if you will, I see the shapes created by that curving petal or folded petal as two separate shapes instead of one. So if you see this image that I've prepared for you here, I have filled in a couple of different petals with two different colors. Both of these petals present those folds or curves that I am talking about, and you can see how I filled in the upper section of the petal, which is curving down or out, with yellow, and the underneath planes of that petal I filled in with blue. So I see those as separate shapes for each of these petals. And as I'm moving along, I have that in mind, and it helps me simplify that process, because I know that oftentimes when we see something like this with all of these overlapping, irregular shapes, it can be quite overwhelming and it is easy to get lost. And I just want to continue reminding you to simplify as much as possible, to work from large to small, and you can also practice zooming into specific sections of the photo where you're working in order to not get distracted with the other petals. So you can see how I'm continuing to slowly but surely make my way into the innermost area. And as I am continuing to add in these medium-sized shapes now for these middle petals, I have these new landmarks, and I'm able to notice if I have to make any changes in the outer petals. During the entire first part of the sketching process, for me, it's incredibly important to keep my drawing as flexible and malleable as possible. Nothing is set in stone. I am able to continue refining anything that I want, as long, of course, as I keep drawing lightly and not pressing down hard. When a lot of beginners are just getting started with drawing, they fall into thinking that every single line and shape that you lay down has to be perfect right off the bat. And this couldn't be farther from the truth. A drawing in its initial stages has to be flexible, and it is expected that you're going to have to start laying down lines and shapes so that you have something to relate to each other, which is how you achieve believable effective proportions, because it's all about those relationships between the different parts making up the whole. So in other words, if you don't start laying down lines and shapes on the page without that fear that they might not be correct, then you're not going to be able to visualize things or have lines and shapes that you can evaluate, that you can then correct and move on to create a successful freehand sketch. You need to just start laying down lines and shapes on the page. And I want to encourage you to look up old masters' drawings or etchings. And you're gonna see these drawings where you're gonna notice these lighter lines that were left on the page. And those are the lines that that sketch or that drawing was started with. Those are the lines that the artist started laying down in order to be able to visualize and start evaluating what the correct shape or angle or whatever the case may be should look like. And then they moved on to actually creating a shape that was more successful using those initial lines and shapes that they laid down very lightly as a type of guide, so to speak. And they just left them there. They didn't even erase them at all. They just made sure that at the end, the actual quote unquote correct figure or whatever it is that they're drawing had a heavier visual weight than those initial incorrect lines that they laid down. And of course, they often moved on to develop shading and more detail and more refinement in that quote unquote correct figure or object drawing, so that at the end has a heavier visual weight than those initial quote unquote incorrect lines. And in this way, the viewer's attention goes straight to the correct drawing, and those initial lighter lines don't really affect the overall interest and quality of the piece, even though those mistakes are left there on the page. But what's important here is that you see those drawings, those old works, so that you can see that even people who are incredibly skilled with drawing are still not going in and creating perfect lines and shapes right off the bat. And of course, the more you draw freehand and the more you spend time practicing drawing specific subjects, in this case flowers and botanicals, the smaller your mistakes that you need to correct will be. And the faster you're going to be able to move through this process, of course. So I just want to remind you that drawing is not writing. Drawing and writing are completely different activities. When we're writing our name or we're writing a sentence, yes, we are expected to write those letters perfectly right off the bat. But when we're drawing, it's a completely different type of activity. And when we're freehand drawing especially, and we're going for mid to higher levels of realism in which proportions have to look okay and perspective has to look right, we want to make sure that we're keeping our drawing flexible in the beginning. Okay, so I'm almost done with the main area, which is the petal area for this rose sketch. And I am about to get started with adding in the stem and the leaves. Now, when it comes to the stem and the leaves, I'm going to be using my artistic license a whole bunch. I am not going to go by the leaves and the stem that are present in the photo. I'm going to be adding more leaves and I'm going to be changing the stem and just taking artistic liberties here. And I'm just doing final refinements here, adding a little bit more irregularity now along the outer edges of some of these petals. And thinking of the entire composition as a whole, and thinking of how these supportive elements, these secondary or tertiary elements, can support the focal point, which is the petal area. I want to make sure that as I am drawing the stem and the leaves, I have a lot of irregularity, asymmetry, and that nothing looks too stiff, because that is not going to lead to very natural results, especially when you're drawing something like an organic object like this one. You want to make sure that there is a lot of irregularity and imperfection and even asymmetry present throughout the object. It's not like when we're drawing man-made or machine-made objects or things where there are perfectly straight lines and oftentimes symmetry. Drawing man-made objects and organic objects is different in many ways. I will make sure to leave a link to a video where I explain much more about the difference between organic and man-made objects and differences in terms of how to draw them down below in the text section of this post so that you can go and check it out if you haven't already. But yes, once I get into the secondary elements or parts or even the smaller shapes, I tend to bring in my artistic license more. Sometimes I take things out, sometimes I bring things in, or I change their location, so that these secondary minor elements can actually support the focal point, not distract away from the focal point, and in general just add to the composition, make it more interesting or balanced. So as you can see here, I decided to add in 6 leaves. I made sure to do it in a very asymmetrical way. I added in slight curves and irregularity into the stems. And even when drawing the leaves, I first created that general shape for the leaf, and then I added in the middle vein. All right, so I am completely done with my freehand pencil sketch, and it is time to get started with the pen and ink process and the alternative shading techniques. And before actually starting to add in our pen and ink into this drawing that we have spent so much time on, I would highly recommend doing some practice drills, loosening up your hand and your wrist, and getting started with the pen and ink process. And also giving thought to the specific techniques that you're going to be using to develop your values / textures in your drawing. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to practice whatever techniques it is that you're going to be using, and to think of the strategy or specific techniques that you're going to be using for each area before going into the final drawing. Especially when it comes to something like this, pen and ink is a permanent medium. We're not going to be able to fix or take back the lines and the marks that we add on the page. So do not skip this part of the process. Yes, it's okay to allow ourselves to let go a little bit in the later stages of this process, but it's very important to visualize and at least do a little bit of planning in terms of what specific alternative shading techniques we're going to be using, and at least doing a general planning for the amount of layers that we're going to be creating and how we're going to be moving forward in the process. And right here, I wanted to show you the 2 main alternative shading techniques that I'm going to be making use of throughout this process. And these 2 techniques are contour lines and cross contour lines, as well as scribbling. Contour lines and cross contour lines are awesome because these techniques really help enhance that curvature present in this type of object. So because there are so many curves present throughout these petals, I really wanted to bring in contour lines and also cross contour lines. When it comes to drawing those contour or cross contour lines, we need to visualize the actual 3-dimensional structure of whatever it is that we're adding this type of shading into. So we have to think of the curvature of the petal. And essentially, those curves that we lay down have to go hand in hand with that curvature present in the structure. And as we're laying down those groupings of curves, there has to be a consistency within those groups in terms of the distance between your different marks or lines, as well as their overall direction that they're curving towards. These marks can start shifting slightly in terms of these distances between each other, their curvature, and even their length within these groups, if it makes sense within that particular part of the subject that you're drawing, and it makes sense with the values that you're trying to develop. For example, if a dark value is turning into a lighter value, the actual form of that structure is changing, and it makes sense, then you can start making those gradual shifts within even one same group of marks, but you really have to stay mindful along the way. Now at the bottom there, you can see contour and cross contour lines. Contour lines would be only one grouping of these curves, and cross contouring is when you add a second group that is slightly overlapping and intersecting that first group of curves. Of course, when we're using alternative shading techniques, the more ink that is covering up our paper, the darker the value, and the less ink that is covering up our paper, the lighter the value. So you can already start kind of understanding how we can combine simple contour marks with cross contour marks in order to create different values. On the top left there, you can see an example of cross hatching, which is the same idea, only with cross hatching, we're using straight lines, intersecting lines that are overlapping each other. And we're doing cross contouring, which are curves and not straight lines. And I really love using contour and cross contour lines as opposed to hatching and cross hatching, because it really helps enhance those curves in those petals and those leaves. This isn't to say that you cannot use alternative shading techniques such as cross hatching or regular hatching to shade in something like a flower, because you definitely can. It's just a matter of what you like the look of. And aside from contour and cross contour lines, you're also gonna see me use scribbling today. Scribbling is a technique I also love. It helps me add irregularity to those edges. It helps me define edges and create greater contrast by darkening darkest areas. I highly recommend doing drills for both, at least for a bit, before getting started with the next phase of this process. Even for me today, at which I already have some experience with pen and ink, I find doing these practice drills before getting started with a new drawing very, very helpful. Notice the tapered effect and the line weight variation that I've managed to create in those little drills for contour and cross contour lines right there at the bottom. Notice how where I started that line or mark looks darker and thicker, and then as I move upward and outward, that line gets thinner and lighter. That's what I'm referring to with line weight variation, and we can achieve these more dynamic effects by moving our arm or our wrist quicker. Now, of course, you have to have a certain level of confidence to move your arm a little bit more quickly. I do have a full tutorial where I explain about different alternative shading techniques, and I walk you through how to shade 6 different spheres using these different techniques. I'll make sure to link to that down below in the text section of this post in case you'd like to go and check it out. I will also be linking to a video where I provide must-know pen and ink tips for beginners wanting to develop their skills faster with this drawing medium. It's time to get started with the pen and ink phase. And the very first step is going to be to trace over your pencil lines. Now remember that we're staying away from a look of outlines, from the look of that line work similar to what we see in coloring book pages, in which we have one consistent line weight all throughout our drawing, right? We don't want that. So as I am tracing over my pencil work here, which by the way, I am using my smaller tip pen, which is my 0.1 for this, I am approaching this in segments, in sections. You can see little tiny sections of my paper in which those lines aren't even connected. And even as I am laying down these little lines, I am keeping that line weight variation in mind. Little tiny sections of my lines or marks are thinner than others and lighter than others because I am shifting the way that I am using my pen in terms of the angle that I am using it at, right? Because using it upright in a 90-degree angle from your page is going to lead to a different effect when compared to using it at a 45 or even a 30-degree angle from your page. Another two things that you can keep in mind and shift throughout this process to create a line weight variation, aside from changing the angle at which you are using your pen in, is changing the speed at which you're moving your arm when you're laying down those marks, as well as the pressure that you're exerting on your paper. I'm continuing to move through this process carefully, tracing over the line work that I had previously created with graphite pencils, keeping it moving, keeping it flowing, because I want to stay away from stiffness and also stop and start marks that happen when you move too slowly or you hesitate and you stop in a single place. And I'm really trying to stay away from the look of cartoony coloring book page outlines where those lines are very heavy, very bold, very stiff, and very thick all throughout all of my petals and all of my elements. I want to stay away from that because those thick, bold outlines with a consistent line weight all throughout the piece is going to lead to flatness. As you can see for this part of the process, I also allowed myself to work from the innermost petals, and I made my way out from there. For this part of the process, I don't think it really matters where you start and how you move through this. Go for what is most comfortable for you. You might find it helpful if you have any trouble with smudging to work from left to right or right to left, depending on whether you're left-handed or right-handed and you like moving towards the left or towards the right. And this can help you avoid any possible ink smudging. Okay, so I do have to explain something about how I did my initial ink work here on the leaves especially. So right here you can see me trace over my pencil work for the stem and the smaller stems leading to the leaves. So what I would love for you to notice here is how I very loosely create the illusion of not only little irregularities and thorns in that main stem, but also how I'm going to create the illusion of the spiky kind of ragged edges along the edges of the leaves, because it's an important characteristic in terms of roses that the edges of those leaves have these little kind of spiky, irregular, jagged edges. And it's important to incorporate this kind of important characteristic into a botanical study like this one, because otherwise you risk this flower looking like some other flower and not necessarily a rose. So I want you to notice how I pay attention mostly to the direction and the angle of those little spikes along the edges of those leaves. And even though I keep things relatively loose, I'm still able to describe that important characteristic of those irregular edges, the teeth along the edges of these leaves, while maintaining that looseness and that level of expression. So it's really about observing those references, right? If you're not able to see leaves clearly in your primary reference photo, you can always support yourself with extra references that do allow you to see these other parts of whatever it is that you're wanting to draw or paint so that you can get that visual information. But once you understand those characteristics that set this type of object, in this case this flower, apart from others, make sure that you're adding in or describing that characteristic, but do allow yourself some level of looseness and expression while doing it. In this case, for example, I need to observe and pay attention to the direction of the angle of these teeth along the edges of these leaves, as well as their size, so that I can get those characteristics in. But within that, I allow myself some looseness. Okay, so I finished with that first tracing phase. I allowed everything to dry completely for around 20 minutes. And then I went over my entire drawing with my soft graphite eraser to completely disappear all of my pencil work before getting started with the next phase of the pen and ink process. And this is the point at which the alternative shading techniques come in. The contouring and the cross contouring, the curves that we were talking about before. Now, Just like when I am painting with watercolor, I always get started with the darkest areas that I'm able to perceive in my reference photo first. So have a good look at your reference photo, notice where the darkest areas are, and I want you to start in those areas. Whatever area it is that you're gonna be working in, take a moment to notice the form, the curve in that one petal. Really acknowledge its three-dimensional form, the way that it's curving, etc., and then start laying down your marks. Try to lay down those groupings of curves in a way that helps you describe that curvature and that structure. If you notice, all of the marks that I'm laying down are slight curves. They are not super pronounced, but they are definitely not straight lines. Now, if you're asking yourself how I know what direction to create that curve in, because if you notice, some of them, they slant off to different directions, right? Especially when I start overlapping them. If you're asking yourself how I know, partly it's just intuition and the fact that I am overlapping marks in order to darken values in darker value areas. But in other cases, it's obvious to me when I see the curvature in the petal in the picture. So whatever petal it is that you're currently working on, take time to notice that petal in the flower in the picture. Notice that particular petal, its structure, its curvature, etc. And take a moment to ask yourself, before starting to lay down those marks, ask yourself if there's any particular way that you can lay down those curves in, those marks in, whether it's from top to bottom, from bottom going upwards, from left to right, whatever it is, to help you better describe that petal. If you ask yourself and you're still not sure, then just concentrate on laying down those marks in any which way. Just make sure that they are curves, slight curves, in the darkest value areas and work from there. Make sure that you're doing your overlapping at this point. In terms of your different groups of marks, only in darkest value areas, and that you're leaving your midtones with a less amount of marks, so maybe just one grouping with no second group overlapping that first group, and make sure that you're leaving lighter value areas with little to no marks or ink in them. Throughout this entire process, stay mindful of the marks that you're laying down. This doesn't mean that you have to lay them down super precisely or perfectly or anything like that. I just want you to stay mindful of what you're doing throughout the process. As you're moving along, really know if you're trying to develop darker value areas or mid-tone value areas or lightest value areas, and make sure that what you're doing goes hand in hand with that. The moment that you stop focusing on what you're doing and you start just laying down lines and marks without really thinking of value and the texture that you're creating, or you simply rush the process too much, this is when you're going to completely demolish any sense of dimension that you're trying to create. And you might even start overworking things and covering up way too much paper with too many lines and marks, which is only going to lead to heaviness and flatness and a lack of dimension. And of course, a messy look overall. If we make a small mistake, it's very likely that it's not going to be that noticeable at the end, or we can just incorporate it as part of the piece. But when we lose focus, when we stop looking at the reference, when we start mindlessly laying down lines and marks without really knowing what it is that we're trying to do along the way, that's when the mistakes start snowballing into something bigger and bigger that we're not going to be able to fix. The innermost sections of all of these petals, as well as those sections where I have overlapping taking place, where a petal that is on top of another petal is creating a cast shadow on the one underneath. Those are the sections where I want to cover up more paper, where I'm doing more overlapping of my contour lines. And then there are mid-tone sections where I am creating some lines, but I'm not overlapping them as much, or I'm creating thinner lines by moving my hand and arm more quickly, which leads to thinner, lighter lines. And then the lightest value sections of the petals, have no lines in them at all. So always remember, the more paper you cover up with your lines and marks, the darker the value. The less paper you cover up with your lines and marks, the lighter the value. So what value are you trying to develop? Remember that value or a tone is number one when it comes to developing a sense of depth and dimension in a drawing or painting. So it's important that we continue observing that reference photo and develop these values in our drawing, always taking into account the three-dimensional structure of whatever it is that we are shading in, and also the light and shadow situation that is happening in this environment. And this is why having a reference photo is so helpful. We can get this information from that photo. We need to learn to observe. How are these petals curving and curling? And what section of these petals is nearest the light source, capturing most of the light? What sections of these petals are farther away from the light or being covered by other petals? Even though we have a reference photo and we're using this photo for clues to make those values happen in a successful way in our drawing to create that sense of dimension, it's not necessary to try to copy the photo super precisely. As long as you're taking that main idea for the light and shadow areas and you're moving forward with the idea in your head that what you're drawing is a three-dimensional structure that is sitting in space and is being affected by a certain light situation in this environment that it is in. Okay, so right here, you can see how I'm already starting to develop a wide range of values. You can already start getting a sense for where darkest values are getting developed, where the midtones are getting developed, and the areas of lightest lights, which I am keeping protected and keeping myself from laying down any marks in. Areas of darkest values and darker midtones are going to be pushed more in later phases. But right now, this is what I would think of as my very first layer of work throughout the petal area and all throughout this flower. And then once this layer is done, I can then go ahead and push those darkest dark areas and create a little bit more contrast, taking my time, working incrementally. And also something that's super important that I'm often doing throughout this process is taking a step back from my piece and really acknowledging everything as a whole and asking myself if I really need to add more marks in any specific area. This is super, super important because it's very easy to start overworking things and start placing way too many marks in a particular area because we get so immersed in what we're doing and we focus too much on one particular area instead of, once again, seeing the entirety of the piece, which is very important to come back to constantly throughout the process. So I would recommend taking little breaks constantly throughout this process and asking yourself if more marks are really necessary, because it's super easy to go overboard with the amount of marks that we create, and all of a sudden we end up creating a texture that we weren't intending to create, or we start flattening areas out. In order to create a sense of depth and dimension, we need to develop that variety of values. And if we add way too many lines or marks into one large section, that's going to flatten that area out. But simultaneously to this, we can accidentally create textures that we weren't intending to create. Because since we're using lines and marks to develop these values, these lines and marks, when they are repeated, can create a visual texture that we're not necessarily going for. You see, whenever you repeat a line, mark, or shape over and over again, you create a visual texture. So when we're using alternative shading or mark making techniques, we need to make sure that we are choosing an alternative shading technique or a combination of alternative shading techniques before getting started with the painting process that will enable us to create the outcome that we're after, but also B, stay mindful throughout the process because it's so easy to overuse them or to start getting sloppy and start laying them down in very messy ways or inconsistent ways, and we won't be able to erase them or take them back. Transitions between our different values are also a lot harder to create when we're using pen and ink when compared to shading using traditional drawing pencils, where you can use blending stumps to create smooth transitions and smooth shading. When we're using drawing pens and we're creating our different values using these lines and marks, there are more variables that we need to control. We have to mindfully create those transitions by either laying down more or less marks as we make our way into darker or lighter values in that gradient, or mindfully change the line weight in that line or mark so that it becomes thinner or thicker. When we're using regular drawing pencils with graphite in them, not only can we erase that, but also there are less variables to control. You can see how even in my leaves, I am making sure to go in with curved lines. I am sticking with the same kind of line that I planned for since the beginning. Only for the leaves, I am also bringing to mind the direction or the angle that would be created by the veins of the leaf, and I am taking that into account as well. So for the leaves, I am using these lines to help me describe both value and texture. I'm referring to the texture created by the veins of the leaves, whereas the petals are smooth, so I'm mostly describing just value. But I am still making sure to use contour lines and cross contour lines for the majority of the piece. I am making sure to stick with the alternative shading technique that I planned since the beginning. I am now working on what I would see as an entirely new layer of ink. And this is when I am bringing in the scribbling technique. And I am going into darkest areas that I'm able to perceive in my reference photo, pushing those darks a little bit further using little tiny scribbling motions. I also switched to a slightly larger pen tip size than what I was using before. And because this is a larger pen tip size, I am able to cover up more paper faster, which is exactly what I want for these darkest dark sections. When you're pushing these darkest dark areas and creating these scribbles, still have irregularity in mind. If you notice, these little areas that I am carving out, they have more of an irregular, abstract shape to them, and I am really staying away from creating any flat, blocky shapes or more geometric-like shapes. I definitely don't want to create anything that looks like a triangle or a little square or a perfect circle or anything like that. And yes, the scribble is actually a line and not so much a shape. But when you're actually creating a very tight little scribble like this, you run the risk of creating a flat, heavy looking shape. And so that is what I mean. See this more as an irregular, abstract shape that you're creating. And if you notice, even within these scribbles, I am leaving little tiny specks of whiteness of that paper shining through in order to avoid that flatness. By leaving those little teeny tiny sections of paper shining through some of those scribbles and also releasing that pressure more and more as I make my way out of those darkest dark areas, I am staying away from that flatness and heaviness and creating even a slight variation in values in these darkest darks. I am also ensuring that there is not a huge contrast and a huge kind of step between the last darker values that I've created with my cross contouring and this new very dark value that I'm creating with my scribbling, because we need those transitions, those steps between our different values, right? And if I go in and just create a very flat, very, very dark kind of blocky little shape, there's going to be a very big discrepancy between that very black darkest value that you've just created and the previous darker midtones that you've laid down. This is one of the reasons why I always like taking it a step at a time, incrementally, because it's always going to be easier to go in and darken with another layer of ink, but we're not going to be able to go back and lighten. Okay, so after having worked on my scribbles there, I am now working on adding a little bit more of irregularity and playfulness into the edges of some of my petals. As you can see, I am going in with longer scribble lines, just in some sections along those edges of those petals. So these are also scribble marks, but instead of having them being very, very tight and concentrated in one little area, I'm creating longer scribbles, and I'm just going over certain sections of some edges of some of these petals. This is going to create definition. It's going to add contrast. I really want to emphasize, though, that I am trying to stay away from the look of thick outlines around all of these petals and creating an outline that has one consistent thick weight all throughout. I don't want that. I am looking for irregularity and line weight variation throughout these petal edges. I am still leaving little tiny sections of paper completely shining through the edges of those petals where those lines aren't even connected. So keep it light with those long scribbles and really jump around from area to area. And again, take breaks. Take a look at your piece from a bit of a further away distance and try not to go overboard and overdo it with the amount of extra lines and marks that you're adding. Okay, so right here I am doing the same thing. It's the same technique with the longer scribbling motions, the longer scribbling marks, but I am going over the stem, and also I'm going to be going over the edges of those leaves and the central vein as well. I almost always finish up my pen and ink sketches with the scribbling technique or incorporate the scribbling technique at some point throughout the process. I love the irregularity, the slight imperfections, and the more dynamic and playful look that we're able to attain via this mark making technique. I've always found it so interesting how different types of lines or different types of shapes or different types of colors or even textures are able to communicate different ideas or different emotions. There's a psychology behind not only color, but even types of line. And so as artists, by knowing about the different elements of art, color, shape, line, texture, etc., we're then able to better make use of them, to manipulate them or to combine them in different ways, not only to make our piece more impactful, but also to better transmit our style, our message, and the mood that we want to transmit. And this is why it's so important to learn about the elements of art. So it's super interesting how a straight horizontal line transmits a different feeling from, let's say, a zigzag line or a curved line. They transmit different feelings and thoughts psychologically. The same thing happens when we see a square versus an irregular kind of splatter-like abstract shape. These elements in and of themselves transmit different ideas and make us think and feel different ways. Some of them, like a square, really transmit a sense of stability, of control, whereas when we see more of an irregular abstract shape that is more dynamic, it has more movement to it. And so it's just very interesting to me how as artists we're able to make use of all of the psychology behind the elements of art to better communicate the message that we want to communicate. And it's also very interesting how each and every single artist discovers his or her own way of using and manipulating the different elements and principles of art to simultaneously bring themselves into their artwork and transmit the message and the feeling and the mood that they want to transmit to their viewers, but also to really create an impactful, balanced, harmonious looking piece. We are in what I would consider to be the very last phase of this pen and ink drawing process. I am still using the same larger pen tip size that I was just previously using for my scribbling process. I'm going back to my contour and cross contour line technique. And what I am doing is I am working on transitions. I'm working on creating more gradual transitions between the darkest dark areas that I just pushed with my scribbling technique and the lighter midtones and the lightest lights. That is what I'm focusing on right now. And I'm really not doing it all over. I'm just doing it in certain petals. Oftentimes, when we go in and push those darkest dark areas, we need to go back and work on those transitions because there is a very big discrepancy between areas of these very dark values that we've created and lighter values. So right here, you're seeing me work in those cast shadows between the petals. I also went back to darken that top area, top visible area of that stem, that central stem right below the petal area, because from what I understand about light behavior, it would add a little bit more depth, contrast, and three-dimensionality into this piece if I darken that top area a little bit more, because the large petal area of this flower is casting a shadow on the top part of that stem, right? I also darkened some areas in some of those leaves. And what I am doing here is I am laying down only one group of curves wherever I want to work on those transitions in. You're gonna notice that a lot of these slightly curved lines are actually longer than that very first group of cross contour lines that I added in the beginning. You're gonna notice that this length of these new lines goes a little bit past that and into the areas of lighter values, creating a nice transition between the darkest dark areas and the lighter areas. And I don't really go in to add a second overlapping group of curves on top of that unless I feel it's really necessary. I also try to make sure that I'm creating tapered long lines where the beginning of that line is thicker and the end of that line is thinner. This helps me create that gradual transition into lighter values. What helps me create those tapered lines and marks where the end is thinner than the start of it is moving my hand and my forearm a little faster, flicking my hand and my wrist out and away from the center of the flower. Of course, other times I am creating those lines coming inwards, starting along the edge of the petal, and I make my way in, flicking my hand and my wrist inwards. Now, if you're asking yourself what direction or angle to create those slightly curved lines in, you can definitely lay down your curves in the exact same way that you were creating your initial curves in that very first part of this process, in whatever area you're working in. But you can also use a completely different direction and play with the way that you're intersecting those curves when you're actually doing cross contouring. So don't get too stuck with the particular direction that you're creating that curve in. What I would recommend though is what I was mentioning in the beginning when we started with the cross contouring. Have a good look at your reference photo and notice the curvature in that petal, if any. And then ask yourself if there's any particular direction that you can create that curve in or going towards, whether it's starting at the top and making your way down or vice versa, or from right to left or vice versa, or with any particular slant that could better help you describe that 3D-ness, that curve, that little structure for that petal. And if there is, then definitely go for it. If there's not, if it's not that clear for you, then just go ahead and carefully lay down that grouping of curves in a way that you feel is going to help you better describe those different values throughout that petal and focus on the values purely. All right, so I'm pretty happy with how everything is looking at this point. I've worked on those transitions. I am liking the level of 3D-ness that I've created throughout the petals, which is the focal point of this piece. I've created a nice variety of different values throughout every single petal. I have darkest dark areas, midtones, lightest lights. I am now just working on pushing that contrast in some of the details in those leaves, especially the central vein there. But even with this, I am doing my best not to go overboard. I am doing my best to stay away from the look of outlines or harsh looking lines or marks that can end up detracting the viewer's attention from the focal point. We definitely don't want that. I am going over that central vein for these leaves to add a little bit more definition, but at the same time keeping things irregular and loose to transmit that illusion of this being an organic, imperfect object. You can see how the majority of these thinner inner contour lines that I've added into the leaves go hand in hand with the direction of the smaller veins that we would actually usually find in this kind of leaf. Not the central vein, but the smaller veins coming out of the central vein. I took that information and just created contour lines going off in that general angle or direction that those smaller veins would go in. Not really trying to draw the smaller veins, but just using that information to create those contour lines. Aside from this, I'm also giving thought to the overall curvature created by the structure of that leaf. And I'm also laying down some marks to help me enhance that curve. And just to finish up this drawing, I'm gonna add a little something that I often like adding to my pen and ink drawings. This is something completely personal. You can skip this part altogether. This is just like a final touch that makes my pieces my own. And these are just some short scribble lines that I like adding along the outer edges of a few of the petals. I really love the playful effect and more of a dynamic kind of movement that it adds into my piece. Less is really more when you're adding this kind of detail. Right here, I'm gonna be adding a couple of these scribbles along a couple of these leaves at the bottom. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys!